I'm Eric Kaufmann, Professor of Politics at Birkbeck, University of London.
What will you be discussing this evening?
Well, this evening I'll be talking about the emergence of what I call two Britons, where we've got one Britain that's overwhelmingly white and the other that is very diverse and becoming even more so, and how that also maps to some extent onto the vote to leave the European Union. And then I want to sort of talk about some of the processes that are driving the ethnic segregation behind two Britons, and actually one of the things I really want to mention is the importance of majority movement decisions, not just minorities, which is where the attention's been, say, in the Casey Review, but on the white majority and its residential choices and school choice decisions.
Can you talk about the value of using a place-based approach to address this issue?
Yeah, place-based approach is very important because very often there are contextual effects from your local area that will influence the way you think and vote and many of the things you do. So, for example, just to take, as a political scientist, if we look at the Brexit vote, for example, areas that had a higher percentage with degrees tended to vote Remain, and it's not just because there were more people with degrees in those areas. It's even if you didn't have a degree, but you lived in an area where lots of people had degrees, your views were shaped by the context of those people. So that's why it's important to understand not just individuals, but also the places that shape those individuals. And we can say the same for other kinds of contexts. So we know that areas that had a significant increase in migration from Eastern Europe, such as parts of Lincolnshire, also had a higher vote to leave the European Union. So it's important to understand not just individuals, but also individuals in their context.
To what extent do responses need to be tailored to specific groups of people?
Well, yeah, one of the themes of my talk is that there's been a lot of attention paid to minority responses. So, for example, in the Casey Review, the emphasis upon conservative Muslims and their lack of integration into modern Britain. What I try to point out is that it's also important to consider the decisions and behavior of the ethnic majority, white British, because that's very important. There are a lot more of them, so what they decide to do is going to have a bigger impact on the segregation picture than the actions of a small number of minority groups. And so what I'm arguing for, in a way, is policy that would help to retain white British population in diverse parts of Britain, because ethnic minorities are heavily concentrated in these areas that are majority minority. And there has been very little attention paid to what might be the white British response to different kinds of incentives. Now, and this is quite important. We know, for example, that white British in diverse areas have in some ways more favorable attitudes towards minority groups because they're in contact. So we do want to try and we don't want that white British share to really decline very steeply. And in some ways that's been occurring over the past few decades. So one of the thoughts is just to try and focus policies on retaining or attracting white British people into diverse or moderately diverse parts of the country.
What is your one recommendation for policymakers?
Well, so when it comes to residential segregation or school segregation, there are only limited policy levers. In a country like Singapore, which is in many ways, it's all public housing, the government is fairly autocratic. They can tell people where to live. So there is no segregation. But in a sort of free society where people can make choices, you have to look at other policy tools around what some people would call nudging, which is that you try and shape the environment in which someone lives in such a way that they might voluntarily choose to do something that might help the general picture. So, for example, it might be the case that when you have new build housing projects, you might want to design homes in such a way that they'd be appealing to white British people. And if we're talking about a diverse area and trying to attract or retain white British in those areas, it might be more of a period design, it might be gardens, or it might be some feature that may cater to their cultural taste. So that could be one option. Another option just might be around schools and the way schools advertise themselves. One of the things we know is that parents, when they're going to choose a school, which determines often when they're going to choose an area to live, tend to greatly overestimate the share of minorities in diverse areas. So it might be useful to list the share of different groups in the school on websites so parents actually can get the accurate information. And so that could be just another nudge that might help people to make decisions that might be socially beneficial.